I'm on my own property, and I haven't committed a crime. Am I being detained, officer?
I'm not playing games. Turn around, hands behind your back, now.
Officer.
You are making a serious mistake.
The sun was high and unforgiving, the kind of bright Saturday afternoon in the suburbs of Charleston that usually meant lawn mowers, sprinklers, and the distant laughter of neighbors. But on Elm Street, in the manicured cul-de-sac of Oak Creek Preserve, the air was thick with something else. Officer Mark Jennings, badge number 2187, felt it in his gut. He'd been with the Charleston PD for 12 years, never making it past patrolman, and he'd developed what he called a nose for things that are out of place. For the past 3 weeks, the thing that was out of place was the new owner of the 2-story colonial at the end of the block, a black man. Jennings lived 3 houses down. He'd watched the moving vans arrive. He'd seen the man, tall, broad-shouldered, probably in his late 50s, unloading boxes himself, not with a crew. He saw him landscaping his own yard on weekends, planting hydrangeas with a focused intensity. He drove a black Lincoln Navigator, always polished. He didn't fit, not in Oak Creek, where the median home price was $1.2 million and the population was, as Jennings would later tell his wife, 95% normal. Today, the man was moving large, heavy-looking ceramic planters from his driveway to the back patio. He was dressed in khaki shorts and a gray, sweat-dampened T-shirt. Jennings was off duty, but the uniform of his mind never came off. He sat on his porch, a cold beer sweating in his hand, and watched. What's he really doing? Nobody who can afford that house does their own heavy lifting, casing the joint. Maybe the house is just a front. The thoughts were automatic, a well-worn track in his brain. He'd seen it a dozen times. A new face, an expensive neighborhood, a story that didn't add up. It was the prelude to a crime. He put his beer down, went inside, and clipped his service weapon to his belt. He didn't put on his uniform, just his tactical pants and a polo shirt, plausible deniability. He was just a concerned neighbor. He walked down the quiet, tree-lined street, his stride purposeful. The man had just set down a particularly large planter and was wiping his brow with the back of his arm. "Afternoon," Jennings said, his voice a little too loud in the quiet air. The man turned. He had a calm, steady face, with intelligent eyes that took in Jennings's posture, his hand casually resting near his hip. "Good afternoon," he replied, his voice a deep, composed baritone. "Live here?" Jennings asked, a question he already knew the answer to. "I do. Just moved in a few weeks ago. Marcus Thorn." He extended a hand, dirt still clinging to the knuckles. Jennings ignored it. "We've had a string of break-ins in the area," Jennings lied. Department records would later show there hadn't been a reported burglary in Oak Creek for over a year. Reports of individuals posing as gardeners, delivery men, casing properties. Thorne's expression didn't change, but a subtle tension entered his shoulders. He slowly lowered his hand. "Is that so? Well, as you can see, I'm just moving some planters. My wife wants them on the back patio. I'm going to need to see some identification," Jennings said, his tone shifting from neighborly to official. "Proof of residence." A flicker of something, disappointment, maybe exhaustion, crossed Thorne's face before it was gone. "I'm on my own property, and I haven't committed any crime. Are you detaining me, officer?" He had clocked the weapon, the tactical stance. He knew. The question, calm and legally precise, was a match to a fuse. Jennings hated lawyers, hated people who knew their rights and threw them in his face. It was what guilty people did. "You're being evasive," That's suspicious behavior. In a high-value area like this, we have to take every precaution. My wallet is inside, Thorn said, his voice still level. I can go get it if you'd like. Or you can run the plates on the Lincoln in the driveway, registered to this address under my name. I'm not playing games, Jennings snapped. I give an order. You follow it. Standard procedure. Now, turn around. Place your hands behind your back. The moment hung in the humid air. Sarah Peterson, a retired school teacher from across the street, was watching through her living room window, her hand hovering over her phone. She'd seen Mark Jennings before, knew his reputation for being aggressive, especially with contractors or delivery drivers who weren't white. This felt different, darker. Thorn stood his ground, his hands held open at his sides. You are making a serious mistake, officer. The only mistake here is you refusing to comply with a lawful order, Jennings said. Unsnapping the strap on his handcuffs, he stepped forward, grabbing Thorn's arm. Thorn didn't resist, but he didn't comply either. His body went rigid, a wall of passive resistance. Officer, Thorn said, his voice dropping, now imbued with a steely authority that seemed to come from decades of command. I am strongly advising you to reconsider this course of action. But Jennings didn't hear the warning. He only saw a black man in an expensive neighborhood defying him. It was a challenge to his authority, to the natural order of things. He twisted Thorn's arm behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed down the street. You're under arrest for obstruction and failure to identify. Jennings grunted, pulling the cuffs tight. From her window, Sarah Peterson pressed record on her phone. She filmed as Officer Mark Jennings, her neighbor, pushed the new owner of the house at the end of the cul-de-sac, a man in handcuffs, towards the curb and forced him to sit, a prisoner on his own property. The afternoon sun beat down on them both, illuminating a scene of quiet, horrifying injustice that was about to become very, very loud. Badge number 2, 187, had finally stopped the wrong man. The precinct briefing room buzzed with the usual Monday morning energy, the smell of stale coffee, the low murmur of weekend gossip, the rustle of papers. Officer Mark Jennings leaned back in his chair, feeling a familiar sense of satisfaction. The arrest yesterday had gone smoothly. Thorn had been processed at the station for obstructing governmental operations, a catch-all charge that would be a headache for him to fight. He'd been released on his own recognizance after a few hours. But the message was sent. Jennings had established the boundary. He had protected his neighborhood. His partner, Dave Miller, nudged him. Heard you had some fun in Oak Creek yesterday. Just keeping the peace, Jennings said with a smirk. New guy got a little mouthy. Had to teach him some respect for the badge. Always. Miller chuckled. At 8, sharp. The doors at the front of the room opened. Mayor Thompson walked in, looking more serious than usual. He was followed by the senior command staff. A current of anticipation went through the room. There had been rumors for weeks about the new chief of police. The old chief had retired under a cloud of scandal, and the city council had conducted a nationwide search, promising a reformer, an outsider who could clean up a department drowning in misconduct allegations. All right, settle down, Captain Davis called out. The room fell silent. The mayor stepped to the podium. Good morning, everyone. As you know, our city has been at a crossroads. We've faced challenges to public trust, and we've pledged to meet those challenges head-on. We promised a new era of leadership for the Charleston Police Department, one built on integrity, accountability, and an unbreakable bond with the community we serve. Jennings suppressed a scoff. Here we go. More corporate buzzwords from a politician. We searched the country for a leader with an unimpeachable record, a deep understanding of modern policing, and the courage to implement real change. The mayor continued. We found that leader. He is a man who has served his country for over 30 years with distinction. A West Point graduate, a decorated combat veteran, and most recently, a strategic advisor to the Department of Justice on police reform. It is my profound honor to introduce to you the new chief of the Charleston Police Department, General Marcus Thorn. The name hit Mark Jennings like a physical blow. Thorn. It couldn't be. He stared at the side entrance as a man walked through and joined the mayor at the podium. It was him. The man from the lawn. The man he had pushed against a car. The man whose wrists he had bound in steel. He was wearing a freshly pressed, decorated uniform now, the 4 stars of a general gleaming on his shoulder. His face was the same, calm, composed, authoritative. But his eyes, as they swept the room, were different. They carried the weight of command. The room erupted in applause, but Jennings couldn't hear it. A roaring sound filled his ears, the blood draining from his face so fast he felt a wave of dizziness. He gripped the edge of his chair to keep from swaying. His world had just tilted on its axis and collapsed into a black hole. He felt Dave Miller stiffen beside him. "Mark," Miller whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. "Is that—" Jennings couldn't answer. He was frozen, a statue of dread. Chief Thorn stepped to the microphone. The applause died down. The silence that followed was absolute. He stood for a moment, his gaze slowly, deliberately moving across the faces of his new officers. He was looking for someone. And then his eyes found their target. They locked onto Officer Mark Jennings. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silence stretched for 5 seconds, then 10. Every head in the room slowly turned, following the chief's unblinking stare until hundreds of eyes were fixed on Jennings. The air became thick, unbreathable. In that silent, piercing gaze, Jennings saw his entire career, his entire life, flash before his eyes. He saw the condescension he'd shown, the authority he'd abused, the blind prejudice that had led him to this exact moment of ruin. The general's eyes held no anger, no rage. It was something far worse, a profound, bottomless disappointment. It was the look of a leader who had just been shown the depth of the rot in his own command before his tenure had even begun. It was a look that said, "You are the problem I was hired to solve. Finally, after an eternity." Chief Thorn broke the gaze and addressed the room, his voice as steady as granite. "It appears," he said, his words dropping like stones into the silent pool of the room, "that my work here begins today." Jennings felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He didn't need a formal investigation. He didn't need a suspension notice or a union representative. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was already a dead man walking. Badge number 2187 was no longer a symbol of authority. It was the number of a ghost. The Internal Affairs investigation was opened before Chief Thorn even finished his introductory speech. It wasn't an investigation. It was a formality. The moment Thorn looked at Jennings, the gears of the bureaucracy had already ground to their inevitable conclusion. What the subsequent file review revealed was not the story of a single, unfortunate mistake, but the documented history of a pattern that had been ignored for 12 years. Officer Mark Jennings, 38, was a product of the suburbs he patrolled. He joined the Charleston PD at 26, a former high school football player with 2 years of community college and a deep-seated belief that he was one of the good guys holding the line against chaos. He lived in a modest home with his wife, Karen, a dental hygienist, and commuted every day to police a community he envied and resented in equal measure. In 12 years, he'd never been promoted. His performance reviews were consistently average, noting he meets expectations but lacked interpersonal skills and de-escalation capabilities. What the reviews didn't say. but the complaint file screamed, was that Mark Jennings had a problem with black men. In his 12-year career, he had accumulated 8 civilian complaints. All 8 were filed by black men. All 8 were closed with no disciplinary action. The pattern was damning. In 2017, Jennings pulled over David Bell, an architect, in Oak Creek for a broken taillight. The car's dash cam footage, later included in Bell's complaint, showed both taillights were functioning perfectly. Jennings claimed he smelled marijuana and conducted a search, finding nothing. The complaint was dismissed as unsubstantiated. In 2019, he stopped Jamal Hayes, a university student, for fitting the description of a robbery suspect. The supposed description was never produced. Hayes was frisked on a public sidewalk and released without apology. Internal Affairs ruled the stop was within departmental guidelines for field interviews. Just last year. In 2022, Jennings was one of 2 officers who responded to a noise complaint at a pool party. The complaint file showed he singled out the homeowner, Robert Peterson, a black lawyer, demanding he end the party while white guests looked on. Peterson alleged in his complaint that Jennings had told him he was lucky this is just ending with a warning. The complaint was closed when Jennings's partner corroborated his version of events, stating the homeowner was verbally aggressive. The partner was Dave Miller. The thin blue line. 8 complaints, 8 black men, 0 consequences. It wasn't a pattern. It was unofficial policy, in stark. Devastating contrast was the file of the man he arrested, General Marcus Thorn, 58. His life was a testament to service and excellence. Born in Atlanta, he secured an appointment to West Point, graduating in the top 5% of his class. He served 34 years in the U.S. Army, earning a Bronze Star for valor in Iraq and a Purple Heart in Afghanistan. He commanded troops at every level, from platoon leader to commanding general of a division. After retiring from the military, he earned a master's in public administration from Harvard. He wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. He'd served on President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. He had become a leading national voice on police reform, helping departments in cities like Baltimore and New Orleans implement consent decrees with the Department of Justice. He was the man you called when a police department was broken and needed to be rebuilt from the foundation up. He literally wrote the playbook on de-escalation, community engagement, and rooting out implicit bias. He had spent his entire adult life building a reputation of unimpeachable integrity. He had moved to Charleston with his wife of 32 years, Eleanor, a retired pediatrician. They had 2 adult daughters, one a doctor and the other a federal prosecutor. They'd bought the house in Oak Creek to be closer to their grandchildren. This was supposed to be his final chapter of public service, a chance to put his principles into practice. This was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful life. The irony was crushing. The man who had trained generals on rules of engagement, who had advised presidents on justice reform, who had faced enemy fire in foreign lands, was handcuffed on his own lawn by a mediocre patrolman with a chip on his shoulder. The expert on identifying and dismantling systemic bias had become its target. Investigators didn't need to dig deep. The preliminary report was on the acting superintendent's desk within 24 hours. On one side of the page was a decorated general, a community leader, a man with a flawless record. On the other was a patrol officer with a dozen years of documented racial complaints, 0 commendations, and a history of manufacturing probable cause. The narrative was clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a good cop having a bad day. This was a bad cop, protected by a broken system, who finally ran out of luck. He had built his career on profiling men who looked like Marcus Thorn, men without the power, the resources, or the public profile to fight back. On Saturday afternoon, under the bright Charleston sun, he had unwittingly arrested the one man who had the power to burn that entire system to the ground. At 5:17 p.m. on the day of the arrest, Sarah Peterson, the retired teacher, finally worked up the courage to do something with the video on her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she uploaded the 2-minute clip to Twitter. She wasn't a social media person, but her son had set up an account for her to follow the local news. She wrote a simple caption. "My neighbor, a police officer, just arrested our new neighbor for gardening. This happened today in Oak Creek. I'm shaken." She hit tweet and put her phone down, not understanding what she had just done. By 8 p.m., the video had 1,000 views. By midnight, it had 100,000, amplified by local Black Lives Matter activists who recognized Officer Jennings's name from past complaints. By the time Mark Jennings was sitting in that Monday morning briefing, the video had 10 million views. It was the lead story on CNN's website. The footage was raw and irrefutable. Filmed from a distance, it was steady and clear. It showed Marcus Thorn, calm and non-threatening, speaking to Jennings. It showed Jennings's aggressive posture, his hand on his weapon. It showed him grabbing Thorn, forcing his arms behind his back. It captured the cold, indifferent click of the handcuffs. There was no audio, but none was needed. The visuals told a story of pure, unadulterated abuse of power. By 10 p.m., Monday, after Thorn's identity as the new police chief was revealed, the story exploded from a local outrage into a national firestorm. The Chiron on every news network read the same. New police chief arrested by his own officer day before starting job. The city was thrown into chaos. Mayor Thompson's office was flooded with calls. Protesters began gathering outside CPD headquarters, their signs pointed and furious. "Badge 2187 equals racist." One read, "If it can happen to the chief, it can happen to you." Read another. The hashtag General Thorn was the #1 trend worldwide. The Charleston Police Benevolent Association, the local police union, was caught flat-footed. They issued a boilerplate statement at noon. "We are aware of the incident involving Officer Jennings and are confident that a full investigation will show he was following established departmental protocols when encountering an uncooperative individual. We urge the public to avoid a rush to judgment." The statement was like throwing gasoline on a fire. The public had the video. They had judged. Chief Thorn spent his first official day as chief not in transition meetings, but in crisis control. He met with the mayor, the city council, and community leaders. He was calm, resolute, and in command. He recused himself from the official investigation, appointing his new deputy chief to oversee it to ensure impartiality. That evening, he went home to his wife, Eleanor. She met him at the door, her face etched with a mixture of anger and fear. She had seen the video. She had seen the headlines. She had seen her husband, a man who had commanded armies, humiliated on the lawn of their new home. 34 years, she said, her voice quiet but shaking with intensity. 34 years I've watched you wear a uniform. I've worried about you in war zones. I sent you off to countries I couldn't even find on a map. And the most danger you've ever been in was right here, in our own front yard, because you were planting flowers. Marcus held her, the weight of the day, of the incident, settling on his shoulders. Later that night, his phone rang. It was his daughter, the federal prosecutor. "Dad, are you okay? I saw the video. Everyone has seen the video." Her voice was tight with controlled fury. "He put his hands on you. Dad, what if?" She paused, her breath catching. "What if you weren't General Marcus Thorn? What if you were just a retired man moving into a new house? Would you be in a jail cell right now? Would I be trying to get you out?" Marcus Thorn, a man who had briefed presidents and faced down generals, stared out the window at the quiet, dark street. And for the first time, he couldn't find an answer that was both truthful and reassuring, because the truth was yes, he probably would be. The system he was hired to fix had almost swallowed him whole before he'd even walked through the door. The video going viral hadn't just exposed one bad cop. It had exposed the terrifying reality that for some, justice is a matter of luck, status, and whether a neighbor happens to be filming. The viral video and public outcry acted as an accelerant, turning what would have been a quiet, internal dismissal into a full-scale federal investigation. By Tuesday afternoon, the U.S. Department of Justice announced that the FBI's Civil Rights Division would be opening a formal inquiry into the arrest of General Thorn and, more broadly, into the patterns and practices of the Charleston Police Department. The city had become Exhibit A in the national debate on policing. The internal affairs investigation, led by Thorn's newly appointed deputy chief, Maria Sanchez, moved with unprecedented speed. Sanchez was another outsider, a respected reformer from the LAPD, and she had a clear mandate from Thorn. No stone unturned, no favoritism, just the facts. The facts were damning. They pulled Jennings's file, all 12 years of it. The 8 complaints were just the beginning. They ran the data for his district, District 4, which included the wealthy enclave of Oak Creek. The numbers told a story of systematic, targeted profiling. District 4's population was only 9% black, yet in the previous year, 58% of all traffic stops initiated by Officer Jennings involved black drivers. 72% of his stop-and-frisk field interviews involved black men. Badge number 2187 wasn't just an officer, he was a heat-seeking missile for racial bias. The department's own systems had failed at every level. The early warning system, designed to flag officers with a high number of civilian complaints or use of force incidents, had flagged Jennings 3 times in the past 5 years. In each case, his supervising sergeant had cleared the flag, noting in the file, "Officer Jennings is a proactive officer working in a high-crime transient area." This was a lie. Oak Creek was one of the safest districts in the state. The supervisors weren't just ignoring the pattern, they were actively covering it up. The FBI's investigation ran parallel, and their methods were more thorough. They didn't just review files, they interviewed people. They brought in David Bell, the architect Jennings had pulled over in 2017. They found Jamal Hayes, the university student he'd frisked in 2019. They spoke to 6 of the 8 men who had filed complaints against him. Their stories were chillingly similar: a fabricated reason for the stop, an aggressive and demeaning attitude, and the feeling of being treated as a criminal for simply existing in a certain neighborhood. Then they interviewed Sarah Peterson, the neighbor who filmed the video. She provided her original, unedited footage. She told them about Jennings's reputation, how other neighbors had commented on his hostility towards non-white workers in the area. The cornerstone of the case was Jennings's own body camera footage. Under the immense pressure, the department released it publicly on Wednesday. The audio was crystal clear. It captured Jennings's lie about a string of break-ins. It captured Thorn's calm, rational questions. "Are you detaining me, officer?" It captured Jennings's escalation, his refusal to listen, his demand for compliance over communication. Most damningly, it captured Thorn's final warning: "You are making a serious mistake, officer." Jennings's defense, presented by his union lawyer, crumbled within hours of the body cam release. He claimed he had reasonable suspicion. Under Terry versus Ohio, the legal standard for a stop, an officer must be able to point to specific, articulable facts to justify their suspicion. Jennings had none. His official report stated Thorn was acting suspiciously and appeared to be casing the property. The FBI tore it apart. Thorn was on his own property, verifiable by public tax records. He was engaged in gardening, an ordinary homeowner activity. His vehicle was registered to that address. He provided his name. He offered to retrieve his ID. There were zero articulable facts to justify the stop, let alone the arrest. Jennings hadn't acted on suspicion. He had acted on prejudice. He saw a black man in a place he didn't think a black man should be, and he used the weight of his badge to enforce his own distorted view of the world. The weight of that badge was now crushing him. The system that had protected him for 12 years, that had dismissed every complaint and excused every transgression, was now abandoning him to save itself. He was no longer a brother in blue. He was a liability. The entire department, and indeed the entire city, was being judged by his actions on that sunny Saturday afternoon. On June 15th, 30 days after the arrest, the verdict came down. It wasn't delivered in a courtroom, but in a sterile internal memo from Deputy Chief Sanchez's office, after a 30-day review, which included the FBI's preliminary findings. Officer Mark Jennings was terminated from the Charleston Police Department, effective immediately. The official charges were a laundry list of professional malfeasance, conduct unbecoming an officer, abuse of authority, filing a false police report, and unlawful arrest. The memo was leaked to the press within an hour. The Police Benevolent Association, which had initially stood by him, saw the writing on the wall. The evidence was irrefutable. The political pressure was immense, and the public was enraged. They filed a token appeal on his behalf, as required by their bylaws, but they put no effort into it. The appeal was denied by the city's arbitration board in a record-setting 2 days. Mark Jennings' 12-year career was over. The consequences, however, had only just begun. Because he was fired for cause before reaching his 15-year vesting period, his pension was forfeited. The entire sum he had paid into the system was gone. The Charleston PD also moved to have him decertified, submitting his case to the National Decertification Index, a database designed to prevent officers fired for misconduct in one state from getting hired in another. Badge number 2187 was now blacklisted from law enforcement, permanently. The personal fallout was just as swift and brutal. His wife, Karen, had endured weeks of reporters camped outside their house, of angry messages online, of being ostracized by friends and neighbors in the community Jennings claimed to be protecting. She saw the man on the video, arrogant, aggressive, hateful, and couldn't reconcile him with the husband she thought she knew. Or perhaps, the husband she had chosen to ignore. 2 weeks after he was fired, she filed for divorce. The bank foreclosed on their house in Oak Creek, the very neighborhood he had treated as his personal fiefdom. The shame was too great to stay. Jennings moved into a small, run-down apartment on the other side of town. He was a pariah. Old friends from the force stopped returning his calls. The thin blue line, which had once protected him, had now closed ranks and left him on the outside. He tried to find work, but his name was now infamous. A simple Google search brought up dozens of articles, the viral video, and news segments about the racist cop who arrested his own chief. No one would hire him for any position of trust. He eventually found a job working overnight shifts at a bottling plant, a physically demanding, mind-numbing job for $17 an hour. He, who had once held the power of life and death over citizens, was now just another anonymous worker on an assembly line. The FBI's Civil Rights Division concluded their investigation in August. They declined to file federal criminal charges against Jennings, citing the high legal bar of proving specific intent to deprive someone of their civil rights. While his actions were clearly prejudiced, proving in court that his intent was criminal, rather than a result of poor training and implicit bias, was a mountain they chose not to climb. But they didn't let the department off the hook. Their report was a scathing indictment of the Charleston PD, citing a pattern and practice of discriminatory policing in District 4, systemic failures in supervision, and a culture of impunity within internal affairs. They recommended the city enter into a legally binding consent decree with the Department of Justice, forcing federal oversight onto the department for a minimum of 5 years. The man who triggered it all, Mark Jennings, was now a ghost in his own city. He saw the news reports about the consent decree. He heard Chief Thorn's press conferences announcing sweeping new reforms. His own downfall had become the catalyst for the very changes he had spent his career resisting. His legacy was not one of law and order, but of ignominy. He was a cautionary tale, a training video of what not to do, a name that would forever be synonymous with the very prejudice his former boss was now working to dismantle. On July 1st, 2 weeks after Mark Jennings was fired, General Marcus Thorn stood at a podium in the courtyard of City Hall. The press corps was packed shoulder to shoulder. His wife, Eleanor, and his 2 daughters stood in the front row. The city was watching. The nation was watching. He had been a chief for just over a month, and this would be the speech that defined his tenure. He adjusted the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, calm and resolute. "I have worn a uniform in service to this country for 34 years, he began, his voice steady and clear. "I have led soldiers in combat. I have advised on national security policy. I believed I understood the full spectrum of risk and responsibility that comes with a position of public trust. But in 90 seconds, on my own front lawn, I was given a lesson that no amount of training could have prepared me for. I was reminded of what millions of Americans, particularly Black Americans, feel every single day. The feeling of being presumed guilty, the feeling of being an outsider in your own community, the feeling of being powerless when confronted by a badge." He paused, letting the words sink in. "My daughter called me after she saw the video of my arrest. She's a prosecutor. She fights for justice every day. And she asked me, through tears, 'Dad, if you weren't a general, if you weren't the incoming chief, would you be in a jail cell right now?' I could not give her the answer she wanted to hear. I had to give her the truth. And the truth is, almost certainly, yes." A hush fell over the crowd. "That is an unacceptable truth," Thorn declared, his voice rising with conviction. "Justice cannot be a privilege reserved for those with rank or status. Dignity cannot be contingent on one's zip code or skin color. Accountability cannot be a lottery. The badge is a symbol of public trust, not a shield from public scrutiny. That trust has been broken. Today, we begin to rebuild it. Effective immediately, I am announcing a new set of protocols for the Charleston Police Department, what we will call the Thorn Doctrine. This isn't just a memo. This is our new constitution. First, a zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling. We are implementing a new anti-profiling checklist for every single pedestrian and traffic stop. Officers will be required to document specific, articulable, non-discriminatory reasons for the stop. This data will be made public and updated quarterly. Second, an overhaul of our body camera policy. From now on, any stop that results in a civilian complaint will trigger an automatic and mandatory review of all available footage by a newly formed civilian oversight board, which will have independent investigative and subpoena power. No more officer's word against civilian's word when the truth is on tape. Third, a duty to intervene. We are implementing and strictly enforcing a policy that requires officers to intervene when they witness a fellow officer using excessive force or engaging in misconduct. The silence of the thin blue line ends today. Your first loyalty is to the law and the public, not to a colleague who is breaking it. Fourth, an early warning system that works. Supervisors who fail to act on officer misconduct patterns will be held just as accountable as the officers themselves. Leadership is not a title. It is an action. He leaned into the microphone, his eyes locking onto the cameras. These are not suggestions. They are mandates. There will be officers who resist this change. There will be those who say this is not the way we've always done things. To them, I say, you are right. The old way is over. Adapt, or find a new line of work. The Charleston Police Department will become a model of modern constitutional and community-first policing. We will earn back the trust of this city, one interaction at a time. Our work begins now. His final words were not a promise, but a declaration of intent. The incident on Elm Street had not broken him. It had given him a mandate. He was no longer just a reformer. He was a man on a mission, armed with the personal, undeniable experience of the very injustice he was now empowered to destroy. 6 months later, the city of Charleston felt different. The changes were not seismic, but they were tangible, like the slow turning of a massive ship. The Thorn Doctrine was no longer just a press release. It was the new reality on the streets. The quarterly stop data reports were published on the city's website, as promised. The first report, released in October, showed that while stops were down overall, the racial disparity in stops had decreased by nearly 40%. It was a start. The new Civilian Oversight Board, comprised of community leaders, retired judges, and civil rights advocates, reviewed its first dozen cases. In 3 of those cases, they recommended disciplinary action against officers for rudeness or improper procedure, actions that would have been dismissed without a second thought under the old system. Cops were on notice, the cameras were always rolling, and now someone was always watching. The federal consent decree was finalized in September. The city council, under immense public pressure, approved it unanimously. It locked in Thorn's reforms and put the department under the watchful eye of a federal monitor for the next 5 years. The culture of impunity was being dismantled, brick by brick. The case of Thorn versus Jennings, though never a real court case, became a national touchstone, cited in police reform legislation in 3 other states. General Marcus Thorn was no longer the new chief. He was simply the chief. He held regular town halls in every district, standing before communities that had long distrusted the police. And he listened. He didn't make excuses. He acknowledged the department's past failings and laid out his plan to fix them. Trust was slow to build, but for the first time in a generation, a bridge was being constructed. His wife, Eleanor, started a local non-profit that offered pro bono legal services to victims of police misconduct, turning their family's traumatic welcome into a source of support for others. And Mark Jennings? He faded into obscurity. He was last seen by a former colleague working at a car wash, his face partially hidden under a baseball cap. His house in Oak Creek had been sold to a young family. His name was a ghost, a reminder of a past the city was desperately trying to leave behind. His story became a lesson taught at the Charleston Police Academy. His body camera footage, a permanent part of the training curriculum on what happens when prejudice is allowed to wear a badge. Badge number 2187 was now a symbol of an era that was, hopefully, over. The afternoon sun still fell on Elm Street, but it seemed to illuminate a different scene. Neighbors talked to each other more. Sarah Peterson, the retired teacher, now headed the neighborhood watch, working directly with the department's community outreach officer. And at the end of the cul-de-sac, General Thorn could often be seen in his yard, tending to his hydrangeas, no longer a suspicious figure, but just a neighbor, a man who had endured the worst of his city to bring out its best. This entire incident hinges on the psychology of a man like Mark Jennings. His actions weren't born from a single moment of poor judgment, but from a worldview built on years of resentment and bias. He likely saw his own stalled career, his modest life, and contrasted it with the perceived unearned success of others. particularly a black man moving into a neighborhood he felt he could never afford. Marcus Thorn's very existence in Oak Creek was a challenge to Jennings's internal sense of order and hierarchy. The aggression was not about law enforcement. It was an attempt to reassert dominance, to put someone he saw as an interloper back in their place. This toxic mix of personal insecurity and systemic racism, empowered by a badge and a gun, is what makes such encounters so dangerously combustible. How could this have been avoided? What if Thorn had immediately declared his identity? He could have said, "Officer, I'm General Marcus Thorn, your new boss, and I suggest you return to your vehicle." The confrontation would have ended instantly. But the underlying problem, Officer Jennings and his prejudice, would have remained. A hidden cancer within the department, waiting for another victim who didn't have a title to protect them. Thorn's choice to let the situation play out, while personally dangerous, was ultimately a sacrifice that exposed the disease for all to see. What if there had been no neighbor filming? It would have been Thorn's word, respected as it may be, against a sworn officer's official report. The internal system, designed to protect its own, would have likely sided with its officer, perhaps with a quiet reprimand. It highlights a terrifying truth. Without objective, irrefutable evidence, the default setting of the system is often to protect itself. The camera, in this case, was not just a recorder, it was the equalizer. The ultimate lesson here is that justice should never depend on the victim's resume. A system that only delivers accountability when the person being wronged is a 4-star general is not a system of justice. It's a system of privilege. Real change doesn't come from firing one bad apple. It comes from rebuilding the entire orchard, tilling the soil of the culture, uprooting the weeds of impunity, and planting new seeds of genuine accountability and public trust. General Thorn's ordeal was a catalyst, but the work is carried on by ordinary people demanding that the rights afforded to a general are guaranteed for every single citizen. What are your thoughts on the duty to intervene policy? Do you believe it can realistically change the thin blue line culture? Share in the comments if you or someone you know has ever had an experience where you felt judged or profiled before you even spoke a word. Your story matters.